Virtue is a state of deliberate moral purpose, a mean relative to ourselves. This mean is determined by reason, much like a prudent man would decide. It lies between two vices, the excess on one side and deficiency on the other. Imagine Aristotle pondering in ancient Greece, contemplating the essence of virtue. Visualize the balance of life where virtue guides us away from extremes. In this journey, we seek wisdom, understanding, and the golden mean. Join me as we explore the depths of virtue and vice, guided by reason.
Virtue ethics is a character-based theory. The target of moral evaluation is not the consequences of the action, it's not the intent or the maxim of the action or the motive of the action. It's the character traits of the agent performing the action and whether those character traits are vicious or virtuous or not. So again, the object of moral evaluation is different here. It's the character traits of the agent performing the action, not aspects of the action itself. Again, either the consequences like in deontology in utilitarianism, or whether it's in accordance with self-interest, or whether the maxim generates a contradiction or not. It's just based on the character traits, right? So you're probably familiar with some of this stuff. There's this episode of South Park called The List where all the girls in elementary school make a list of the most attractive boys. And Kyle gets ranked very low. Cartman gets ranked above him. Butters is number 11, so his parents decide not to ground him. I feel bad for Butters. And Kyle gets ranked very low, and of course Cartman makes fun of him for that. And Kyle gets very distraught about this. And so South Park, Abraham Lincoln comes to visit Kyle. Abraham Lincoln is often reported to have been a very virtuous person, and he wrote about the virtues as well. And so they do this goes to Christmas past, future, present kind of thing with him. And he goes and shows that the kids in South Park that were really good looking didn't develop any of their character traits. And so later on in life, they turn out to be basically shallow and miserable people. They don't have any friends because they just got by on their aesthetics the whole time rather than cultivating any character traits. That's the basic idea of a virtue ethic. And there are different versions of virtue ethics. We're going to look at Aristotle. So it emphasizes good character, not so much right conduct. Key example is Aristotle here. You got to wake up during class. If you need to excuse yourself, take a break, but just don't sleep. That's perfectly fine. There's vending. If you need a snack or something, there's a vending machine at the end of this hallway too. All right, so we got virtue ethics. Key example is Aristotle. He's usually the classic example of this, but there are other versions of this. In the late 20th century in philosophy, there was a revival of virtue ethics, and most people took their point of departure from Aristotle, but there are other versions of this as well that come from Hume. People have gone back and looked for information on the virtues in people like Kant and Mill, and sometimes they look at virtue as a secondary feature, but not so much a primary feature of the theory. David Hume's an example of one that's very different from Aristotle. Nietzsche has a kind of virtue ethics as well. But Aristotle will be our example here, classic example. So he begins with this thing called the function argument, or what we call the function argument. It's about the soul, but what Aristotle means by the soul is not so much like an immortal thing that survives the death of your body. It's basically your psychology, is what he's driving at here. And all living things have a soul here, and there's a nested hierarchy in this. So he says man or human beings, it's the animal with logos. Logos means reason. So the fact that we have a rational capacity is what distinguishes us from other animals, right? And so in that way, Aristotle's very much like Kant, because what the key thing in Kant was rational faculty, right? Not just being able to experience pleasure or pain. And so what's distinctive about human nature is our capacity for reason. It has to be cultivated, but we have a capacity for reason. And let's just give, as a general minimalist definition of reason, that you can think and reflect upon what reasons you do and don't have for action and even change them. So thinking about thinking critically, right? So Aristotle says that all living things have a soul, and then humans, there's a three-part aspect of the soul. All living things have the nutritive part of the soul, according to Aristotle. What he means by that is they basically take in energy and grow. So plants have that, animals have that, human animals have that as well. Then there's the perceptive part of the soul, and this is the part where you can really tell that he's not talking about like a Christian or a religious notion of the soul here, because that's basically your sensory apparatus. You take in sense data and respond to contingencies in the environment. So plants do that, but animals do that even more, right? And then on top of the hierarchy is beings with reason. So for Aristotle, that meant human beings only. Contemporary Aristotelians have to worry some stuff about some primates there, but for our purposes, we don't have to worry about that. So that's what's distinctive of human nature. So perfecting, sometimes these approaches to ethics are called perfectionist views of morality, because it involves the perfecting of our most distinctive capacities, right? So rationality. So once again, reason is what's driving the moral concern here. So in ethical egoism, it's self-interested instrumental rationality. Same thing in social contract, but we're forming a contract out of our self-interested rationality. In deontology, it's that universalizability test and whether it generates any formal or contradictions of the will. And then in utilitarianism, it's adding up units of pleasure and pain and getting the total of that or the average of that, and then figuring out which action would maximize overall happiness and minimize overall pain. And that tells us what's right or wrong. And then for Aristotle, it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have teleology, but his teleology is going to be a little bit different than Mill's or the utilitarians, even though they're still talking about happiness. He's got a very different notion of happiness in mind. So again, a little bit more on this function argument. So the point is, like a lot of these normative theories, they're not always debating. There are differences between moral conclusions in some of them, but mostly what they're debating over is how to justify those sorts of things. And then sometimes, given the rationality, the form of reason involved, it might lead to a different conclusion, but most of them are fairly, how can we justify common sense morality? Some parts of it are going to get jettisoned, but, make it coherent somehow, right? So Aristotle's doing the same kind of thing, so we're going to have to worry about, how to achieve the telos here. So presumably, he says, however, to say that happiness is the chief good, so there it is, happiness is the end, that's the telos. We're all trying to be happy again. In that way, very similar to Plato that we covered earlier, Socrates. So it's the chief good seems to be a platitude, and a clear account of what it is still desired. This might be perhaps given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as a flute player, a sculptor, or any artists, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So it would seem to be for man, if he has a function, have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and man has none. Is he naturally functionless, or as eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function, may one lay down that similarly man has a function apart from all of these. So that's what he's driving at here. So the goodness, moral goodness, notice I've switched from right and wrong to goodness here. It's not an innocent shift there. The goodness of something is based on how well it performs that function, how well it achieves that telos. So a good basketball player, to give a non-moral example, how good do you dribble? How good do you put it in the basket? Right? How well do you run the plays? All those sorts of things. Right? Make a good basketball player. Playing within the rules and trying to score those points to win. Right? Savannah.
So Aristotle says that the character traits are either an excess or in deficiency, right?
Yeah, for vices.
Right, for vices. And I was just thinking, but if what determines it is the appropriate how appropriate it is for the situation, right?
How appropriate it is to meet that telos, not just the situation.
Okay. That makes sense.
So it's much longer. It's how to live, not just how to deal with a certain situation.
Okay.
So again, it's a broad question there. So it's not going to be just appropriate for the situation. It's going to be appropriate for achieving this telos.
All right.
Which is defined by how well human beings use their reason.
But then again, who defines how appropriate it is?
Metaphysics.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
So I'll give you an example here in a second.
Alright.
I'll start with a non-moral example that'll get the point across. The mistake a lot of people make at the beginning when they're first learning about Aristotle is saying, oh yeah, my function is that like I want to be an accountant. But that's not what he was just talking about. He talked about man in general, not just your social role. Right? So what then can this function be? Life seems to be common to even plants. That's that nutritive part of the soul. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. Next, there would be a life of perception, but it also seems to be in common even to the horse, the ox, or in every animal. There remains then the activity of life, the element that is a rational principle. That's what's defining man. And so the highest good or the final good, that thing that's intrinsically good, is happiness. But happiness here is eudaimonia, not just like pleasure like the classical utilitarians. So eudaimonia is about functioning well to achieve a telos. It's about well-being. So those are probably, human flourishing is probably a better term than just happiness, because it's not, happiness here is not just waking up on the right side of the bed one day. It's not a fleeting mood. It's a habit. In fact, he goes so far as to say, call no person happy until they're dead, which implies that it ain't up to you whether you are happy or not even. It's up to the people who knew you the best, right? So you want to have a good funeral, not a bunch of people dancing on your grave. So the final end is happiness. As we desire some means to something else, instrumental goods, it's evident that all not ends are final ends, but the highest good is clearly something final. Hence, if there is only one final end, this will be the object of which we are in search of. And then he goes through and rejects pleasure, he rejects money and stuff like this as being the final end. And so he comes out on happiness. He said, clearly it's a human virtue we have to consider for the good we are in search of. As it said, a human good and happiness, human happiness. And one part of the Nicomachean Ethics where this comes from, it's the main book most of this comes from, he wrote it. He says ethics is just the search for the human good, the rational search for that good. So the term he uses here is eudaimonia, but it's not being in a good mood. It's not pleasure like the classical utilitarians. It's fulfilling the human function well. So he says virtue then is twofold, partly intellectual and partly moral. And intellectual virtue is originated and fostered mainly by teaching. It's the acquisition of information and stuff like that. Moral virtue, on the other hand, is the outcome of habit, and accordingly its name is ike, derived from a slight variation of ethos or habit. It's not just one-off action, it's what kind of habits do you have? In other words, what kind of character traits have you habituated or cultivated, right? So from this, it's clear that moral virtue is not implanted in us by nature. We have to cultivate it. So again, it's an ethics of self-cultivation, character cultivation, if you want to call it that. And then we get his normative standard, which is the golden mean. Right. So by mean, in terms of the thing itself, I understand that which is one and the same time for every man. By the mean relative to ourselves, I understand that which is neither too much nor too little for us, but this is neither one and the same for everybody. Virtue, then, is a state of deliberate moral purpose consisting in a mean relative to ourselves, the mean being determined by reason, or as a prudent man would determine it. It is a mean, firstly, as lying between two excesses, the vice of excess on the one hand and the vice of deficiency on the other. So here's my non-moral example. Let's say that I've got a rose bush. How would we know if the rose bush is flourishing or not? What signs would there be that this plant is flourishing?
Color? I'm sorry.
Sorry, give me something else.
Yeah, a lot of roses.
Yeah, roses is going to produce blossoms and bloom, right? And so what we want to do is for our rose bush to rose bush, right? To excel at rose bushing. What happens if I give that plant too much water? It'll die. What if it gets too little water? It'll die. What if it doesn't get enough sunlight? It'll die. What if it gets too many nutrients? It'll die. What if it gets not enough nutrients? It'll die. So we've got to figure out how to get it the right amounts, given all the circumstances around it. Has it rained lately? Then I'm probably not going to water my rose bush. This kind of stuff. So excess and deficiency. So now let's go to a moral example. and just use temperance. So moderation with regards to pleasure, and let's just use alcohol as an example here. What happens if you consume too much alcohol? What does it do to your reasoning? It undermines it, right? And Aristotle said, man is the animal with logos. So drinking to the point of undermining your reasoning is bad. That would be excessive drinking. Doesn't mean you can't drink at all, but you better learn how to hit the sweet spot, right? Young drinkers always fail at this. They don't eat right and then go drink. And then you know somebody that's like this. If it's a guy, they're probably either like trying to fight people or, like crying and ruining the party because they got too drunk or something like this, right? So they're not hitting the right spot. They haven't figured out how to maintain their reason, but enjoy a little bit of alcohol there. So given most people's physiological dispositions, they could enjoy alcohol up to the point of not undermining their rationality, and they'd be morally good, according to Aristotle. Right? Some people have a problem with controlling their alcohol. I know people like this. I know some people that can have a little bit of alcohol and, they're pretty good about stopping. But I know a few people that once they start, it doesn't end until something bad happens, right? And then you do that habitually enough and you're not only undermining your rationality, but you're undermining your own health, right? Because you can give yourself cirrhosis doing this sort of stuff on a long enough timeline. So temperance doesn't mean I have to be a teetotaler. Certainly going to mean I'm not going to drink to excess all the time. I've got to learn how to habituate the mean and hit the sweet spot, but that's going to depend on all sorts of things, like how much I exercised that day, how much I had to eat with respect to when I'm consuming the alcohol, and so on and so forth. My wife, she can have 2 martinis and be fine. 3rd martini, I have to carry her home. Me, on the other hand, I can have like 7 Jaeger shots, and I just become really charming. Right, so virtue is a state of deliberate moral purpose consisting in the mean relative to ourselves, right? But as a prudent man would determine it. Everybody should be generous, but what generosity means for Mark Cuban, y'all know who Mark Cuban is, right? He's a billionaire, right? Versus a college student is going to be different because their means and resources are different. If a college student working down at the Chimes on a waiting job, if they donated $100 or $200 a year to charity, I'd probably think, well, given their relative means, they're still a generous person. But if Mark Cuban only gave $200 a year to charity, I'd think he's a stingy asshole, right? Because he's got way more to, if that dude doesn't tip at the restaurant, that's a problem, right? Stinginess. So you don't want to be a stingy person. You want to be a generous person. But what that means is going to be harder to figure out based on your relative means and situation, right? So we end up with a big list of virtues from Aristotle. He goes way past the 4 cardinal virtues in a few respects. And we won't get all the way into the weeds on these, but down the middle there is the golden mean. Then we've got excess and deficiency, and over here, the sphere of action and feeling. So Aristotle thinks that we have to cultivate and shape our feelings in the right way as well. So you've all probably seen this before. There's a little kid, he's got an ice cream cone. His ice cream cone falls down, and they start what? Crying. And what do the parents do?
Scramble.
They tell them, look, it's okay. You just dropped your ice cream. It's not really worth getting all worked up about, right? So you have to learn to habituate your reactions to appropriately, right? Not overreact or don't underreact to situations. So it's a matter of forming virtuous habits. So the golden mean, courage or bravery is a mean between rashness, running into battle foolhardily, is the excess, deficiency, the first shot's fired, and you run away. Courage is in the middle of that, right? With respect to pleasure and pain, we just talked about temperance, right? So temperance is the golden mean. Self-indulgence, you probably know someone that foregoes all sorts of things that would be prudent for them to do so that they could just take more Molly. Right. Coachilla's coming up. Temperance is in the middle. Insensibility, people that are like misers and deny any pleasure at all, on the deficiency there. With respect to getting and spending, so you got magnificence, right? Stinginess, vulgarity or extravagance, right, is the excess. Following up on that, honor and dishonor, so you got appropriate pride, and then you have vanity on the one side, and then undue humility, or like a, what we call it, maybe self-deprecation to a fault, is the deficiency. So you probably know somebody. This happens especially with kind of college students. It happens with lots of people, but in college, I feel like when you're at that age, it's a little bit more. You probably know someone who basically thinks they're going to be a very successful person in life, and you kind of expects everybody to already treat them that way. Right? So, you know, they're vanity. They got vanity, or it's empty vanity. You should get approved for your accomplishments, not what you think you're going to accomplish. Right? So anger, being angry in the right way, at the right time, and the right person is hard. Usually what happens is someone treats you like shit, and then you punch down on the next person that you see. You don't go back and get that person, right? So you got to habituate your anger the right way, and be angry in the right way at the right time and the right people. That's hard to do because sometimes you just get hangry, right? So again, you got to watch your blood sugar level there to try to be virtuous, right? And patience is in the middle. Self-expression, here's one that's really beyond the four cardinal virtues that Plato had. Boastfulness, and this is the one that you kind of read about a lot for today, was in conversation, really the next one. Truthfulness or honesty, and then underestimation or mock modesty. So boastfulness, someone who makes more of their accomplishments than they actually are, right? Nepo babies, they didn't earn it. They got it because of who they knew, right? Truthfulness, being honest about yourself is hard. This is why you need friends, according to Aristotle. And then mock modesty, or oh no, I didn't really do anything. People that don't accept praise very well, right? Even when they deserve it. And then buffoonery, here's where we get close to humor that you read about for today. I had y'all read The Office, not The Good Place, right? Yeah. Good Place is the other one in 1000 Indian. So for today, y'all read about boastfulness with regard to The Office, and you can do this with the British or the American version of it. The article's on the American version of it, I think.
That's on the British version.
Is it British version? There are like two of those, and one of them is one and one of them is the other, right? So boastfulness, I'm going to use Jim. I'm going to use the American Office because it's what's in my head right now. So with conversation, buffoonery, who on The Office is the buffoon?
Jim?
Michael Scott. He lacks self-awareness, so he also lacks intellectual virtues there. Usually the joke is on Michael, right? Because he lacks self-awareness, right? So it's buffoonery. They are a slave to their own sense of humor. On the other hand, boorishness, the bore. Who's going to be the bore in the American Office?
Yeah. No. Dwight.
There it is.
Can't tell a joke, can't suffer those who do. Jim is closer to the middle of wittiness. He plays little practical jokes on people. Are they generally out of malice? No, they're out of like razzing his coworkers a little bit. And when he takes it too far, he feels bad for it. Right? He experiences the appropriate guilt for his wrongdoing there. So buffoonery, Michael Scott, wittiness, Jim, the virtue of humor there, and then boorishness, we get a Dwight. Then with regard to social conduct, obsequiousness, it's like people who they're like social isolated people, basically. They don't want to talk to anybody. They don't want to engage anybody. On the other hand, in the mean, you have friendliness there, and we'll come back to friendship here in a second. And then the deficiency, you have people like me that are cantankerous. They're just old begrudging, shaking their fist at the sky. These kids today, right? And then with shame and indignation, we have these things as well. So modesty, for example, is a virtue for him. I used to use this. I'll go ahead and use it. Chris Rock used to have one of his stand-ups earlier on, and he talked about being a dad and raising a girl. And it's kind of it's not the best example, but he talked about, dads whose daughter end up in strip clubs. They have not taught their kids appropriate shame for doing that. Modesty is in the middle, shyness, the excess there, and then indignation, which is different than resentment, right? So righteous indignation is being mad about the right things at the right time in the right proportion. Envy is excess, deficient spitefulness, malicious enjoyment, the German word Schadenfreude. There's taking pleasure in other people's misery. I got to watch that one because every time a Tesla blows up. So here's a little bit more on vice of buffoonery here. So Aristotle says the buffoon is a slave to their own sense of humor, right? That fits Michael pretty well. Jim, a bore, which can neither make a joke themselves nor put up with those who do. It's like they lack a sense of humor and don't regret it, right? But you wouldn't want to be friends with a person like that, would you? Probably not. Jim in the middle. So those who joke in a tasteful way are called ready-witted, which implies a sort of readiness to turn this way or that, which are the sallies of thought and the movement of character. So Jim, an inappropriate joke for the circumstances. You wouldn't show up at a funeral and start telling like sex jokes, probably, right? Or make jokes about the dead person in the cabin. That would be inappropriate. It's too soon, right? It's inappropriate for the circumstances, right? So again, just like trying to figure out how much water to give that plant, it's going to be a little bit experimentation in there when you're learning, right? But then you figure it out, you try to habituate it, and then you start to recognize which situations start to call for which virtues, and then what action should follow from that. And for the virtue ethicists, they're very different, at least Aristotle, because it doesn't look like there's one and only one right answer all the time. There could be different ones here. So it's a little bit looser in that respect. That's going to pose a problem for, it's going to be the basis of one of the criticisms of virtue ethics here. So justice. Ethical justice and ethical egoism is, me achieving what's in my rational self-interest. In social contract theory, it's keeping and abiding by the agreement, not being a knave or a fool. Justice for utilitarianism is acting in ways that maximize overall happiness. So achieving justice, a perfectly ideal state would be a state in which we've achieved like the optimal level of happiness over pain, right? In deontology, justice is respecting rational agents and never using anybody as a mere means, right? Again, universalized maxims, right? Acting only on universalizable maxims, right? But for Aristotle, it's a matter of proportion. So think about grading here. I like grading as an example here. This then is what is the just is, the proportional. The unjust is what violates the proportion. Hence, one term becomes too great, the other too small, as indeed happens in practice. For the man who acts unjustly has too much, and the man who is unjustly treated too little of what is good. In the case of evil, the reverse is true. For the lesser evil is reckoned a good in comparison with the greater evil, since the lesser evil is to be chosen than the greater, and what is worthy of choice is good, and what is worthier of choice is a greater good. He's using that greater good language, but again, what he means is well-being, not just units of pleasure being maximized there. So think about grading. We've got a grade scale. Everybody gets an equal opportunity. You get the same course requirements, right? You're held to the same grading standards. But if I started assigning A's to people who only achieved like a 75, then I would be giving them too much. I would be unjust, right? They're getting rewarded out of proportion to their accomplishment. So that's what justice is here. It's being rewarded. It's like merit rather than just equal opportunity or equal treatment. It's about merit or desert in the deserving sense. Like, so you punish people in accordance with their crimes or their wrongdoings, not too little or too much. So one person tells a little white lie, you're not going to chop the tongue out, right? Too little on the other hand, right? So again, it's a matter of proportion, rewarding in accordance with their accomplishments. So another key important element of Aristotle's theory, as we just saw in the list of virtues and vices, is friendship. Didn't see this pop up much in the other moral theories. In fact, most of them told us not to worry about friends at all. We're just supposed to not worry about whether it's our friend or not and just start running a universalizability test or calculating up units of pleasure and pain without regard to whether they're our friend or not. So Aristotle says that wishing to be friends is quick work, but friendship is a slow ripening fruit. Those who wish good things to their friends for the sake of the latter are friends most of all because they do so because of their friends themselves and not coincidentally. Sometimes when I walk through Free Speech Alley on certain days when the Fellowship of the Consuming Fire is out there, they'll tell me I'm a whore. Mm-hmm. Right? But they don't know me. So they don't. Their judgment is more about making them feel good than it is any kind of accurate assessment of my character, right? So I don't pay much attention to them. But if one of my good friends, one of my lifelong friends came to me and said, you're not treating yourself very well, you're not treating others very well, you're using them for your own sexual gratification, you're not really respecting them at all, am I going to take that more or less seriously than the yelling at me on the street? Yeah. I'm going to take it more seriously. Bless you. So, wishing to be friends is quick work, but friendship is slow ripening fruit, right? And so then he has 3 layers of friendship, and 3 is the highest, obviously. Friendships are the good. Friendships of eudaimonia, to be more straightforward there. First, all societies, in order to make them work, have to have friendships of utility. I don't want just a mechanic that is technically proficient at fixing cars. What kind of mechanic do I want? One that is honest. Not going to sell me stuff I don't need, right? So friendships of utility. We need relationships with others in our community to do the things that we can't do for ourselves often. So friendships of utility. That's the lowest kind of friendship. Next up, we have friendships of pleasure. And I like to think of this as like your friends from like your intramural sports teams or something like that, where you're a friend with them because you both find this other activity like enjoyable, right? Or as a part of your life. So, you're going out to win the game with them. You have casual friendships with them. It's more like what Aristotle would think of as acquaintances, right? But you're not, talking about your life problems with those people. You're just going over and getting a beer with them after work. Everybody put their phones away for me, please. And then we get friendships of the good. And these friendships are rooted around the development of virtue and are aiming at, even if they're asymmetrical, achieving the good. In order to be honest about yourself, you need a good friend to help you be honest about yourself. Right? So that's why self-assessment is hard and you need friends, because we're always biased in our own favor, right? So friendships of the good are like friendships around which you're like rubbing off on each other in good ways, in virtuous ways. When you were in high school, and maybe even now still, your parents were probably really worried about who you hung out with. Why were they worried about who you hung out with?
So you come.
Yeah, they don't want you to develop bad habits. They want you to develop good habits. And so that's what Aristotle is all about, is identifying that mean and trying to habituate that mean for each one of those virtues. So it's difficult to be virtuous. It's not a math problem or an algorithm like utilitarians and deontologists are trying to figure out. So he says that's why it's hard to be good, for it's always hard to find the mean in anything. It is not everyone, but only a man of science who can find the mean or center of a circle. So things like math, that science admits of a great deal of precision, right? But morality, not so much. And so Aristotle thinks it's a mistake for us to expect more precision from a field of inquiry than that field of inquiry admits, right? So not going to look like an algorithm, like we were trying to get out of utilitarianism and deontology with universalizability tests. So finding the mean. First, we have to avoid the more opposed extreme. So like if I'm mad about something, I want to try to not flip out and start punching people. Right? Avoid the easier extreme. I like Reese's peanut butter cups but I got a problem with Reese's peanut butter cups. If I get the bag that says like share on it, I don't share. I just I'll plow through that thing. My wife has to hide them from me if she wants to get any. So avoid the easier extreme. I have to avoid those things that I know that I most easily fall into, right? So I have all sorts of anger issues, so I try really hard, not to drive very much around Baton Rouge. So we must also examine what we ourselves drift into easily, for different people have different natural tendencies toward goals, and we shall come to know our own tendencies from pleasure and pain that arises in us. We must drag ourselves off in the contrary direction. So I got to worry about self-indulgence a little bit. I fall too easily into that. And then, of course, just be careful with pleasures in general, because we're already biased towards those sorts of things that make us feel good. But again, like think of alcohol or like a drug, right? If you take too much MDMA on a long enough timeline, you will end up a depressed person, because your body will compensate and produce lower serotonin because it thinks that it's going to get a shit ton of serotonin from you in pill form. So there are a lot of people my age that I went to college with that have depression now because for many, many weekends, too many raves. So you got to be careful with those pleasures. So living virtuously, another way of putting this here is that everyone ought to act in ways that promote virtue and the flourishing of human persons. Jerry Smith, he's milquetoast. He's too deferential to everybody else. He's insecure. He lacks self-confidence. So he's not a very virtuous person. On the other end, Rick is mostly excessive. He doesn't care enough about other people. He has lots of intellectual virtues, but he's always using people, not really, he doesn't really appropriate the mean at all, right? In fact, for Kantianism, he's just a really good example of using people as mere means, including his own family, because Morty's protecting his brainwaves from getting found out from the thing. So he's not even like reconnecting with his family for good intentions, but to use them for his own purposes, right? So you see the same thing with this kind of thing. Jerry lacks some virtues. He certainly is not courageous, right? Then we get to the good place. I didn't read this one, but I'll go ahead and mention it anyway. Are y'all familiar with the Good Place? So I watched the first season of it. There were philosophers that were on staff for that movie, or at least two that I know of. One of the characters, if you're not familiar, is an ethics professor in the show. And so, is it possible to become a good person? Could Eleanor become virtuous or not? So Aristotle on moral development, we'll come back to another theory of moral development here in a little while, is that, we're aiming for the virtuous ideal. Lots of people, very, very few people can just hit that without reflection or without agency. And in fact, you don't get credit for it without deliberation, but that's what we're aiming for. There are some people who are strong-willed, and it's easier for them to hit the mean a little bit. They don't have so many hang-ups that they're able to, and they're good at reasoning, so they can do that. Weak-willed persons, like I just mentioned, I'm weak-willed about Reese's peanut butter cups. And then a vicious person whose most of the character traits are on the extreme or the deficiency all the time. Right? So in order to habituate that properly, to aim towards the ideal, she should start surrounding herself with decent people, right? And letting those habits rub off on her. So, so another way of thinking about this then is and people think, oh, well, we all have different ideas of virtue, but we won't have time to do it today, but we could do it. You can do it in your own head here. Write down a list of the character traits that you think an ideal person would have, and I guarantee you there's going to be a lot of overlap with everybody's in the room, right? So what kind of, we think of what an ideal virtuous person would look like. What are all the character traits you would have to have in order to be a person of that sort? And then go about the business of trying to habituate those character traits. That's how to become a good person according to Aristotle. And then next week, last day of class, we'll look at some criticisms. We're going to look at two in particular. There's lots of criticisms of Aristotle's teleological conception of human nature. Just real quickly, Aristotle's philosophy was basically what most people thought was true up and through the Middle Ages, right? And then you get modern science, and they figure out these efficient causes, but they never find a final cause to human being, certainly not one about happiness. So his metaphysical system gets thrown out with the rise of modern science. That was the basis upon which he built even his ethics, right? So that gets knocked out. So contemporary Aristotelians have this problem of trying to either try to defend that in the face of modern science or some other objections. So that's the first one. Most of us probably think that we're picking our own telos, that we don't have one built for everybody. But for Aristotle, there is only one way to flourish as a human being, so he still has that kind of single nature to it. We're going to focus mostly on the indeterminacy or no clear standard objection, and I want you to think of all the other theories that we've been looking at up to this point, especially deontology and utilitarianism. They're like, how do we distinguish permissible, impermissible, and obligatory actions? Well, the criticism of virtue ethics is that it doesn't give us a decision procedure for figuring out those sorts of answers. It gives us a thing that says be generous. Well, how generous do I need to be? The utilitarians will tell you people in affluent societies ought to be giving up about 20% of their expendable income to be a decent charitable person, right? But for Aristotle, how much is that? Where do we draw the line? Those sorts of things. So we will have, the reading for next week is a response to that objection by a contemporary virtue ethicist. First House is her name. And then there's another objection called the situationist objection from social psychology. And it says that people don't have, or it at least calls into question, the key assumption of Aristotle's theory, namely that people have stable character traits in the first place. So we'll have to worry about that a little bit. There's some evidence from social psychology that looks fairly damning on the face of it, and they did I'll give you one little hint of this study here. It's called the Good Samaritan study. Do you know this one? It's like, so y'all know what a seminary is, right? Where people go to train to be ministers, right? So we would expect people that are in seminary to be like conscientious, moral people worried about what's right and wrong, correct? Right. So they did this experiment where they set up a person to give a lecture on the other side of campus. They caused them to be late on the front end without them understanding that this is the experiment, and also put a person in distress in their path on the way to give their lecture. Most of the seminarians ignored the person in distress to go try to be on time. So situationism. Do we really have stable character traits, or is our behavior more explained by subtle features of our environment rather than having a particular character trait? Right, so that's the situationist objection. We'll look at those more next time. Feel free to take off. If you have questions, stick around. We've got about 11 minutes till the end of class, so I can cover anything you have questions about.